share a very interesting story with you. If you love to read books or love to watch movies, then I'm sure you have come across R.K. Narayan's The Guide. And many of you also know that The Guide is one of the most iconic films in Indian cinema, starring the legendary Wahida Rahman and Dev Anand. But what many might not know is that an English version of the movie was also made, which was directed by Tad Danielewski, who is an English speaking Western director. However, during the shooting of the English version, the director told Wahida Rahman, "You need to do a dance sequence with a snake. And not just dance. You have to hold the snake and kiss it on the mouth." Now can you imagine? Wahida Rahman, a celebrated and graceful actress, being asked to kiss a snake? Naturally, she laughed and said, "How is that even possible?" But the director was firm and he argued, "In India, this is common, isn't it?" But the story doesn't end there. When the snake escaped from its basket, chaos broke out. And guess who was the first to run away? The director himself. When the snake was finally caught and the director returned, Wahida Rahman looked at him and said, "You ran away first." To this, the director replied, "I'm scared of snakes. I'm not Indian." And Wahida Rahman responded, "Just like you, I am also afraid of snakes. So let's cut this kissing scene and shoot the song properly." This incident demonstrates the hypocrisy that Edward Said critiques in Orientalism. Write down the name of the topic: Orientalism, written by Edward Said. The West constructs the East as exotic, mystical land demanding that people conform to this imagined narratives. Yet, when faced with the same realities of their own expectations, like actually dealing with a snake, their fear and discomfort reveal how shallow and baseless these assumptions are. And this story shows how Orientalism is not just academic theory. It is something we can see in everyday interactions, especially in how the West often misrepresents the East in popular culture. Over here, the director assumed things about Indian culture without understanding its complexity. And this is exactly what Said talks about in Orientalism. How the West creates a distorted image of the East, not to understand it, but to define itself in opposition to it. In this case, the director's insistence on the snake kissing scene was not about Indian culture. It was about projecting an exotic and othered version of India to suit a Western narrative. Now, let's start by imagining something we see every day in movies, television, and books. That is how the East or the Orient is portrayed. Think of a common movie like Aladdin. It shows a fictional Middle Eastern city called Agrabah. But how is Agrabah presented? It is full of magic carpets, exotic places, belly dancers, and thieves, almost like a fantasy land. But have you ever wondered why does the East gets portrayed in such a specific and stereotypical way? Edward Said, in his book Orientalism, answers this question. He says the East, or what he calls the Orient, is not just a real place. It is a concept created by the West. But what does this mean? According to Said, the West, which refers to the Europe and America, has long imagined the East as mysterious, exotic, and inferior. By doing this, the West could show itself as rational, modern, and superior. Now, let me explain this with a quote that Edward Said has used. He has said that the Orient was almost an European invention, a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories, and landscapes, remarkable experiences. This means Europe wasn't describing the real East. It was creating a fantasy version of it. And this fantasy served a purpose. It made the East look backward and uncivilized so that the West could justify colonizing it. For example, European countries like Britain and France would say, the people of the East cannot govern themselves. They need us to bring progress and civilization. And this idea of the East as the other, which means strange, something which is strange, different, and inferior, was not just an innocent misunderstanding. It was a deliberate tool for domination. So, Orientalism is not just about how the East was imagined, it is about how those imaginations helped the West control and exploit the East. Now, in this book, Edward Said has given 3 definitions of Orientalism. The first one is the academic Orientalism. Now, imagine a group of scholars sitting in a room in Europe, studying the languages, religions, and histories of the East. Naturally, you would think that they are just curious, right? But Edward Said argues that their work was not neutral. These scholars were often working during colonial times, and their research helped European powers like Britain and France control the East. For example, when the British ruled India, they studied ancient Indian texts like the Vedas and the Mahabharata. At first glance, this seems like the respected Indian culture. But in reality, they were using this knowledge to justify their control. They said things like, "We understand your culture better than you do, so we are better suited to govern you." This is what Said means when he says knowledge is power. And scholars used their knowledge of the East to create stereotypes and control colonial rule. Even today, academic Orientalism shapes how people think about the East. For example, history textbooks in many Western countries still focus on the East as a land of emperors, mystics, and religions. But they rarely show the East as modern, scientific, or industrialized. This is how Orientalism continues to influence our thinking. And therefore, Said has given a definition of Orientalism where he says, anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient, and this applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or philologist, either in its specific or its general aspects, is an Orientalist, and what he or she does is Orientalism. This is the exact thing that I have explained just now. The second definition, what Said talks about, is the imaginative Orientalism. This is how the East is represented in art, literature, and movies. It is not about studying facts. It is about how people imagine the East. Let's go back to Aladdin. The movie shows the East as a magical, chaotic, and dangerous place. There's a street market full of thieves, a palace with an evil vizier, and people riding on magic carpets. None of this is real, but it shapes how audiences, especially in the West, think about the East. Said calls this process the silencing of the other. Now, what does this mean? It means that the East does not get to tell its own story. Instead, the West tells it for them, using stereotypes that fit Western fantasies. And therefore, Said defines Orientalism as a style of thought that creates a binary opposition between the Orient and the Occident, and that justifies the Western political domination of the Orient. I'll just read out the definition that Said has provided. Said says, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and, most of the times, the Occident. Now let's come to the most important idea, the third definition of Orientalism, where Said says that Orientalism is a discourse. Orientalism is not just a collection of random stereotypes. It is a discourse. Now, what is a discourse? It is a system of ideas, beliefs, and practices that shape how we think about something. Edward Said borrows this concept from French philosopher Michel Foucault, who said that power is not just physical, it's also intellectual and cultural. And therefore, Said says that Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. In a simple way, Orientalism is a way of thinking that helps the West maintain power over the East. For example, when European countries colonized the East, they did not just send armies. They sent scholars, writers, and artists who produced books, paintings, and studies that reinforced the idea that East was backward and needed Western control. And this is how Orientalism became a tool for domination, not just through guns and laws, but through ideas and culture. I'm also going to read out the third definition that Said has provided. Said says that Orientalism is a systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment era. It is because of Orientalism the Orient was not a free subject of thought or action. Now let's talk about the relationship between power and knowledge. Let's discuss how knowledge and power are connected. Think about an event in history. Napoleon Bonaparte. Think about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Napoleon did not just take soldiers with him, he also brought scientists, historians, and artists. Now, this might seem odd at first, but these intellectuals were tasked with studying Egyptian society, its culture, its history, and even the iconic pyramids. But why was this knowledge so important? It was not just out of curiosity or a desire to learn about Egypt's ancient civilization. Napoleon wanted to use that knowledge to justify the invasion and to portray Europe as intellectually superior to Egypt. By collecting knowledge about Egypt, Europe could present itself as a progressive civilization that was helping a backward land. And this knowledge was not neutral or purely academic. It served a political purpose. It helped to legitimize colonial rule by presenting the East as a place that needed European intervention to advance. And this is exactly what Edward Said discusses in Orientalism, the relationship between knowledge and power. In the West, knowledge about the East was not just about describing or understanding it. It was about controlling and dominating it. The Western narratives about the East shaped perceptions in a way that made colonizers seem not only acceptable but necessary. These descriptions of the East as primitive or in need of saving were part of the power structure that justified Western control. Now, here is something important to consider. During the British colonial era, there was a belief that Western knowledge was far superior to anything from the East. Thomas Macaulay, in Macaulay's Minutes of 1835, once said that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. This statement itself reflects a colonial mindset. Macaulay, along with many others, saw European knowledge as the pinnacle of human understanding. And this dismisses the vast and rich intellectual tradition of India and the Middle East. In a way, this dismissal of Eastern knowledge served to justify British colonial rule over these regions, claiming that East needed the West's superior knowledge to move forward. Even today, we can see how knowledge shapes power dynamics. Take the example of media portrayals of the Middle East. Often the Middle East is depicted as a land of violence, turmoil, and extremism. These representation reinforces stereotypes, making it easier for Western countries to justify military intervention and political actions. Just as Orientalism helped justify colonization by presenting the East as in need of help, these portrayals of the Middle East now help legitimize actions like military intervention, reinforcing a cycle of power and control through knowledge. Now let's discuss the impact of Orientalism. In the book Orientalism, Edward Said highlights how it created lasting stereotypes about the East. These stereotypes were not just casual observations, they were deeply ingrained in Western culture and shaped the way people viewed the East. It is said that the East is sensual and exotic. Think of the image of belly dancers. The East was often depicted as a mysterious and luxurious place full of exoticism. This idea of the East as a land of sensual pleasures often overshadowed the complexities of its culture. It turned entire societies into mere objects of fascination for the Western world. Again, it is said that the East is lazy and backward. This stereotype portrayed Eastern societies as stuck in time. While the West was moving forward with technology and progress, the East was often depicted with outdated symbols like camels and ancient cities, and this reinforces the idea that Eastern culture had not evolved. Again, there's also been said that the East is despotic and violent. Think about how Eastern societies were often portrayed as chaotic, filled with cruel rulers and endless wars. This stereotype made the East seem incapable of self governance, and this portrayal helped justify Western colonial intervention, as if the West was bringing order to a chaotic land. Let's take the example of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's a popular Hollywood movie, but if you look closely, it is full of Orientalist stereotypes. The movie shows India as this strange, exotic, and dangerous place. There is a scene where the characters are served bizarre food like chilled monkey brains and snake surprise, which makes Indian culture look strange and unrelatable. There's also a lot of focus on mysterious rituals and dark dramatic depictions of temples, and this reinforces the idea that India is a land of superstition and backwardness. Now, why is this important? These kind of portrayals are not just about entertainment. They shape how people, especially in the West, think about Eastern cultures. After watching a movie like this, someone might assume that all of India is like what's shown on screen, full of snake charmers, dark rituals, and outdated traditions. This is exactly what Edward Said talks about in Orientalism. Said explains that Orientalism is not just about describing the East. It is about how the West creates a version of the East that fits their narrative. In movies like Indiana Jones, India is not shown as a real place with a rich history and diverse culture. Instead, it is turned into a fantasy land, one that is either scary or in need of saving by a Western hero. So, when we watch movies like Indiana Jones, it's important to ask, who is telling the story? Why are they showing the East this way? And how does it shape the way we think about these cultures? By asking these questions, we can begin to move beyond the stereotypes and see the East for what it really is, a place as complex, modern, and dynamic as the West. Now let's talk about how we can critique Orientalism. Edward Said challenges us to think about who gets to tell the story of the East. He says, the Orient is not an inert fact of nature. It is an idea that has a history. But what does that mean? It means that the East is not some static, objective reality. It is a concept that has shaped over time, and the West has largely been the one doing the shaping. Said argues that the East has its own voice, its own history. But Orientalism silences that voice and replaces it with a narrative created by the West. So, when we think about the East, we need to question who is telling the story. Why is it that Western scholars, media, and politicians have historically had the power to define the East? Syed does not just leave us with a critique, he also offers a solution. He suggests that we need new ways of studying cultures, ones that are more collaborative, respectful, and free from stereotypes. Instead of relying on these Western dominated narratives, we need to make spaces for the East to speak for itself. By doing this, we can start to see the world as it really is, not just through the lens of Western imagination. And this approach, according to Said, is not just about fairness, it is about truly understanding the world around us. It is about listening to all voices, not just the loudest or most dominant ones. And in the end, Orientalism is not just about how the West views the East, it is about how power works. It shows us that representation matters. Who gets to tell the story and how they tell it shapes how we see the world. Our job is to challenge these stereotypes and listen to all voices, not just the loudest ones. So here ends our discussion of Orientalism. If you think that this video has helped you in any way or the other, do like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.